Excellent discussion. Very challenging. Let's see where it goes, right? Okay, so it's 4:45, and we've come to the end of the substantive portion of our program. But here to help us assimilate what it is we've learned today, we have a tradition here to have Kai Carmody, who is our Canadian National Director of the Canada-United States Law Institute, give us a summary. Kai is an associate professor at the University of Western Ontario's Faculty of Law. He teaches courses in public international law, international trade law, and international business transactions. He's been a visiting professor at Georgetown University Law Center and at the Emile Noel Fellow at the Jean Monnet Center for Regional and International Economic Law and Justice at NYU School of Law. Kai is a noted and published expert on legal issues concerning international trade and climate change. So Kai, we're looking forward to your summary.
Thanks very much, Steve. For those of you I haven't met, I'm Kai Carmody and the Canadian National Director of the Institute. I've attended these conferences since 2000, and this year's subject promised to be one of the more immediately compelling ones. I've been asked to provide some brief closing remarks virtually this year since, unfortunately, I haven't been able to join you personally in Cleveland. The broad subject of the conference, our conference this year, was interdependence, a phenomenon that's rooted in biology. We humans are members of a uniquely interdependent species. We create and rely upon a lot of different goods that couldn't be produced in a single human lifetime. And this includes things like vaccines, it includes jet travel, it includes the internet. In the latest phase of our interdependent life together from 1990 on, we have entered into an era of hyperglobalization, which has left the impression of the world as flat. And although there are some indications now that this hyperglobalizing trend has moderated, interdependence in the form of global supply and value chains remains enormously important. But as was pointed out this morning, this massive offshoring and hollowing out of economies linked to globalization since that time has created a number of vulnerabilities and emphasized how markets have become over-reliant on a few globally efficient sources of supply. I think it's fair to say that in this contentious atmosphere, there seems to be a growing ambivalence about the net benefits of interdependence. Our day began with a reminder from U.S. Ambassador Cohen of the benefits of cooperation, the fact that Canada and the U.S. are longstanding partners, and that this partnership, the latest iteration of which takes the form of the roadmap for a renewed U.S.-Canada partnership, must continue to flourish, but can only do so if equitable and sustainability considerations are front and center. He suggested that we must not only build back from the pandemic, but we have to build back better. At the same time, as our first set of panelists reminded us, that may be difficult to do. Diane Francis, who chaired our first panel, observed that we're in an era of freer trade, but cracks have begun to appear in the current free trade framework. Communities have been offshored to death. This has caused backlash. In addition, the pandemic has aggravated weaknesses in supply chains, and now we have the war in Ukraine to complicate the situation. Supply chains are being politicized and revamped. The big question is, what does this revamping and repoliticization look like? Alex Panetta has tried to provide some clarity on what this latest phase of interdependence would look like. This comes from US legislation in the pipeline, but it also comes from the realization that the two countries need each other. A few years ago, Canada had proposed sectoral trade agreements with China, and there were differences with the United States over renegotiation of NAFTA. Now, Ukraine and wider geopolitical threats have brought us together. However, as both Todd Spangler and David Schreiben reminded us, there's a lot of uncertainty out there. We could be on the cusp of a recession. Our second panel was chaired by the incomparable Chris Sands on the subject of supply chain challenges in the North American auto industry. Chris reminded us that the auto industry was doing supply chain before supply chains became cool. This was a wonderful introduction to comments by Ann Wilson, who noted that the auto sector, or that in the auto sector, we have a convergence between auto parts issues, trade policy, and human rights concerns. A closure at a tier 1 manufacturer can have a cascading effect on tier 2 and tier 3 manufacturers. Rolling shutdowns are something that are not uncommon today and have impacted the North American auto industry across the board. There are also new pieces of legislation. Several mentions were made across the course of the day of laws like the U.S. Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that are complicating the regulatory environment. Sarah Goldfeder pointed out, in addition, that the North American auto industry is facing a perfect storm, encountering stressors and preferences that need to be addressed, and often this can be traced to issues of people. As Warren Alley memorably pointed out in perhaps the most colorful of the comments for today, these days it's 1 person and 7 dogs. In other words, there are significant demographic challenges going forward for both of our countries. Goldfeder made the associated point that it's potential, not credentials, that count in this modern working environment, as the experience of General Motors has profiled at its Oshawa truck plant. In a tight labor market, there's a need to be creative. Beyond that, as Ann Wilson has observed, considerations of inclusion may require going to some unconventional places like banned areas and prisons to train and hire future personnel. At lunch, U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary Rachel Pointer spoke about the importance of shared goals in the Canada-U.S. relationship in the fields of trade, climate change, resource extraction, and supply chain resilience and competitiveness, in addition to the importance of human rights protections, including community safety, dealing with the issues of systemic racism and anti-discrimination. The two countries, she asserted, cannot hope to convincingly advocate for human rights protections abroad when these same rights are not fully protected at home. She reminded us that the Canada-U.S. relationship is a force multiplier for both countries, but also stressed that in such a kaleidoscopic relationship, there have to be ways to respectfully disagree and seek mutually acceptable solutions. Our first afternoon panel on the future of energy supply chains in North America was highlighted the fact that there are a number of energy issues that enter into the consideration of our joint relationship. Gary Sutherland asked, how do we address energy needs of some communities versus others while assuring environmental objectives? What is the best interests of ratepayers while meeting green targets? There was some indication on the panel that the energy industry feels it's been unjustifiably focused on in terms of emission reductions. The commentary suggested that better, more holistic and comprehensive planning are needed in the energy sector. Heather Ferguson also reminded us that every type of energy generates waste. This is a given. J.B. Chronister also chronicled how for them and for his company, the real challenges arise in trying to confront the issue of greenhouse gas emissions for a company like his, a major steel producer that's trying to achieve a 25% GHG reduction target by 2030. In our second panel of the afternoon, chaired by Selma Lusenberg, we looked at ESG issues in North American supply chains. Companies are being held responsible for ESG targets. Few companies are islands, as Selma pointed out to us, and publicly traded companies are being rated for their ESG performance now. However, it's a changing landscape, and expanding ESG considerations play a role in that process. John Dreimer spoke about human rights. What we've seen is a transition from soft law norms to harder norms in business and human rights, particularly since 2015, especially as countries have looked to each other's experiences. John pointed out, however, that these laws can be broken down into 3 clusters: those of transparency and disclosure norms, those of mandatory human rights due diligence laws, and sanctions and penalties. All of this ends up leading to human rights as more and more of a business imperative, an expected part of how business is to be done. But there's also criticism that mandatory requirements potentially lower the bar for companies. The thought is that mandatory requirements reduce best practices and may incentivize less stringent corporate behavior. In sequence to that, or following that, Reg Manhas looked at the transition from CSR to ESG of the last through decades through a very personal lens. He identified the move from a move from a negative and reactive posture, what companies should not do, to a sort of more positive and proactive posture, what countries should do, and on to incentives tucked into national policy frameworks. Michael Torrance also shared with us what ESG obligations require in the domain of financial services. He also suggested that the problem identified earlier of downward drift in standards may not be so serious because companies are essentially self-regulating and in corporate competition with each other. A somewhat different approach was taken by Van Hampson, who asked sort of three major questions. First of all, why is ESG the new mantra? Second, what is the impact of this move on Canada-US relations? And third, a more general question, is it good? And Fenn's opinion is that it's really gridlock in the US political system that has prompted the move to ESG, with an attendant loss of sovereignty for both Canada and Mexico, who wind up being takers versus setters of standards in this domain. There are no unified ESG standards, he noted, and so it's a bit of a Wild West. ESG introduces an enormous amount of complexity and cost. Fenn says that as a result, governments may wind up losing control, so that if you're going to set rules, keep it simple, not complicated. The speakers that we heard from today, and many of the interventions, left much food for thought for this and future conferences. I think they highlighted how it's tough to speak of supply chains and interdependence where everything is potentially related to everything else. In closing, however, I'd like to thank our sponsors, particularly our platinum sponsors, Cleveland Cliffs and DLA Piper, our gold sponsors, the Consulate General of Canada in Detroit, and our silver sponsors, Ontario Power Generation, Baker Hostetler, Cassidy Levy Kent, Suncor Energy, and Dickinson Wright. I'd also like to thank my fellow Institute co-directors, Stephen Petrus and his lovely wife, Colleen Fitzpatrick Petrus, who I spied smiling in the audience today, the Institute's managing director, Ted Paran, as well as this year's program director, Steve Payet. Ted and the Steves have worked very hard over the last few months to put this conference together, and they continue to do so with great efficiency, imagination, and skill. The organizers have asked me to remind everyone that there's a post-conference dinner at Michelangelo's Italian Restaurant and Wine Bar at 2198 Murray Hill Road in Cleveland. Unfortunately, the post-conference dinner is something that I can't join you at this year. I have very warm memories of the conference in past years and wonderful post-conference dinners with plenty of red wine and enormous cannoli the size of tree trunks in Cleveland's Little Italy neighborhood on Mayfield Road, just behind the law school. However, as the father of a one-year-old girl here in London, Ontario, who has just learned to crawl, I have to get home to give her a bath, a bottle of formula, and maybe some stories, and then put her to bed. Nevertheless, the organizers have asked me to remind you that transportation from the conference to the restaurant and back to your hotels will be provided. So thank you very much to everyone. Merci beaucoup. Stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you next year in 2023, hopefully in person, in Cleveland for the 47th Annual CUSLI Annual Conference. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Kai, for that outstanding summary. I also want to say thanks to our technical staff, which was led by Eric Seiler, as well as Martin Roska and his personnel, who made all the technology happen correctly. But that's been a great 46th annual conference of the Canada-United States Law Institute. Thank you all for coming. Keep your eyes and ears open. We will be back for our 47th. We will have our experts meeting in Washington in the fall. So everybody, we stand adjourned. Thank you for attending.